Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is unwavering support in challenging times. It's the expertise to try to minimize risk while maximizing opportunities. Can do is being right here for you through every eventuality. Can do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk, and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
It's the week ending Saturday the 15th of October, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen rates on British mortgages hitting their highest level since the 2008 financial crisis. Shock jock Alex Jones ordered to pay $965 million for spreading fake news about Sandy Hook, and the death of Murder, She Wrote star Dame Angela Lansbury at the age of 96. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Sorcha Bradley from the One Decision podcast, journalist Julia Macfarlane, and we welcome back book reviews editor for the International Affairs Journal, Mariana Vieira. Julia, before we get going, can I just say thank you for joining us at all because you have COVID?
Sadly, yes. I did my best to avoid it over the last 2 years, but I have now fallen. And it is grim.
First time. Didn't realise you were popping your COVID cherry as well.
Yeah, well, I'm pretty sure I caught it in March 2020 before tests were a thing. I lost my sense of smell for 2 weeks back then. But I managed to avoid it since then. But I got a sore throat last week. I tested positive the next day. And I have to say, I was completely floored and unprepared for the back and joint pain that has come with this variant. Really, really not fun.
And when you say this variant, I mean, that's interesting, isn't it? Because it all seems very 2021, this. So this kind of fits our brief of being under the radar. People aren't talking about COVID much anymore, but you're the third person this week that I've encountered. I mean, anecdotally, I don't want to scare people, but it does seem like a lot more people are getting COVID again. What strain do you think it is?
Do you know what? I've definitely been very cocky about the fact that I'm fully vaccinated. I've spent most of the pandemic in lockdown. I didn't catch it earlier this year when my partner got it. And I just coincidentally started taking the tube a lot more often in the last week. And there's no way to know, of course, but I suspect that I may have caught it from the tube. And I wasn't wearing a mask. And so, a lot of people are warning, hey, don't forget about COVID. It's still here. And I'm afraid I'm paying the price for it.
Yeah, and possibly could have given it to another 10 people in your tube carriage as well. And all that's just gone out the window, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to make you feel worse. You are up first this week. Let's get on with the news. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Why oil is no barrel of laughs for Joe Biden.
I don't think it's a priority as much as it's just something that was on his plate and he did. The priority is to get gas prices low, and what we need to do is be very tough on Saudi Arabia. I mean, after all we've done for that country, President Bush, the first Bush, defended them against Saddam Hussein, made sure that they weren't invaded. We give them all of the weapons, 70% of their weapons. For them to do this to the American people is outrageous, and we should say if they don't reverse their decision, we're going to stop sending them weapons.
California Congressman Ro Khanna speaking to Fox Business. Julia, what's the story?
This week, President Biden vowed that he would impose consequences on Saudi Arabia, who recently teamed up with Russia to cut oil production. This is the recent decision by the OPEC Plus cartel to cut production in oil by 2 million barrels a day. And this has caused an absolute firestorm in Washington. Remember, we're in the run-up to the midterm elections, and President Biden has taken it extremely personally.
Yes, it sounded that way, Sorcha, from what we just heard there from Ro Khanna. The Democrats clearly feel the timing of this is to influence the midterms in the United States. Talk me through how that would work.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously the cut in oil production has been seen as a bit of a geopolitical move on one hand. Higher oil prices would result in a windfall for Russia, which can further sort of bankroll their invasion of Ukraine. But also it has been seen as Saudi Arabia's kind of first foray into trying to influence US electoral politics. And, not just that, but essentially kind of set the stage for getting Trump reelected in the next election.
And why? Why would the Saudis want Trump back?
Trump and Saudi Arabia had a close relationship during Trump's administration, and Trump broke with presidential tradition by visiting Saudi Arabia and signed a huge weapons deal with the country, and has also, Trump has also repeatedly defended their crown prince against, accusations that he had a hand in the murder of the Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. So there is a close relationship there, and I'm sure it would be beneficial for Saudi Arabia to, have their man back in the White House, basically.
Do you see it that way as well, Mariana? Because it's not as if Joe Biden hasn't tried to groom Saudi Arabia himself. We all saw that famous fist bump with MBS.
I think the U.S. is a bit acting like a hurt ally in the region. And I feel like they need, first of all, if this is all it takes to re-elect Trump, then I'm already scared regardless of what Saudi Arabia does. If this is the one thing that's going to decide the elections, then please let's run for the hills. But also, it's the language that Biden is using to talk about consequences, and it's almost as if Saudi Arabia or the other oil-producing countries are these federal states that the U.S. also has to manage. And this rhetoric is dangerous, partly because it reminds me of the risks that Obama was running with his. I don't know if you remember the red line with the Syrian army and like the idea of empty threats, because then the Americans don't have the domestic support to pursue these measures abroad. But also that the other countries do have other geopolitical interests that the US has to navigate. So it's a bit of a two-way interaction. And in the context of the war in Ukraine, it sort of presents a rare opportunity for the OPEC plus countries to enrich themselves with high oil prices, which this decision would influence, would help the Gulf countries replenish their financial reserves and actually have positive impacts on like microeconomic growth indicators. So it would then increase their soft power. So it's a sort of like looking at the need for Arab oil in a pragmatic way for the Gulf monarchies as a lever of influence in the bargaining chip that they can use. Also because Saudi Arabia has been slightly resentful of how the US distanced itself, and as Sorcha was mentioning earlier.
I mean, are they taking a risk as well, Julia, the Saudis, that potentially this isn't just words and America does stop buying their oil? That would be a problem for them, wouldn't it? It's one thing having Russia on side, but Russia makes their own oil.
I think that's true, but I think it really speaks to sort of the depth of betrayal that the Saudis, and not just the Saudis, but the wider Gulf region feel at the current US administration. I think Sorcha was absolutely right to point out that, it's a completely different change of tone from when President Trump was in office. And remember, there's a whole lot of symbolism with the president's first overseas trip. And traditionally, US presidents have used that first trip after winning an election and their inauguration to sort of set the tone and put forward, their priorities. We saw President Obama, he chose to visit neighbor Canada's capital, Ottawa, for his first trip. President Bush chose Mexico. President Biden, his first trip was to the UK, another close ally. President Trump chose to go to Saudi Arabia, and the Saudis pulled out all the stops for him. They felt that his predecessor, Obama, was way too soft on their rival, Iran. Trump then flew to Jerusalem to solidify that relationship with the Israelis. And in contrast to that, you have President Biden, who, made a big deal during his campaign to hold Saudi responsible for its human rights crimes. During his campaign, he said he would make it a pariah state and that he would end arms sales because of the war in Yemen. And of course, his administration released that report that concluded MBS personally ordered the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And it's not just that, but in his bilateral dealings with the Saudis, Biden has always done he's always had his conversations with King Salman, not MBS. And the White House will say, this is procedure because his counterpart is not the crown prince, it is the king. But MBS is the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia. And so they have felt really quite snubbed by the US. And in terms of the wider Gulf, the UAE has also been upset with the US because when their territory came under attack from Houthi missiles in Yemen, the US didn't even phone them to offer their condolences.
Yeah, but to my question, they still need the US, don't they? It's all very well feeling snubbed and expressing it, but if the US then stopped buying your oil, that's a problem for Saudi, isn't it?
I mean, that absolutely is, but I think this is part of trying to get what you want, trying to force the US to come back to the table. And, we saw President Biden coming to the Gulf earlier this year with his begging basket on that very controversial trip to Saudi Arabia. There were reports that trip was on the agenda, and he didn't confirm it for months. And he even had to write an op-ed defending his trip before he went. And the Saudis did give him something after that bilat he had with the Saudis this month. They announced that production would be boosted by 1 million barrels a day, but this cut by 2 million, I think, is just so huge because it now takes us to a worse place than before Biden went to the Middle East for that trip, which cost him a lot of political capital.
And Sorcha, Mariana was saying, we should run for the hills if America really is going to make a decision at the midterms based on this. But the price of gas at the pump is a huge issue for Americans, isn't it? Especially people who live in rural areas, depend on their cars, and frankly don't have much interest in international affairs.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an economy and a nation that is dependent on fossil fuels, and the price of fuel is a major driver of inflation as well. So by cutting the production of oil, it is a strategic attempt to sort of, impact the American economy, especially at a time where there is, as across the world, a cost of living crisis. And I've got a question for Julia, actually. Just thinking about Saudi Arabia's relationship with the Trump administration and Saudi Arabia's relationship with the Joe Biden administration now, which has clearly soured. To what extent is that due to maybe sort of diplomatic failings on Joe Biden's part and, as maybe a negotiator, or if he's simply sort of been given bad advice in terms of how he should be dealing with Saudi Arabia?
I mean, it's a really interesting question. Saudi Arabia has been a necessary but very difficult strategic partner for the US. And, I spoke to a former defense secretary under President Obama earlier this year who did have criticisms of that diplomacy. And he mentioned the fact that, the Biden administration had dropped the ball when it came to cultivating that relationship with the Saudis. But remember, Biden is a Democratic president. There is a lot of unease with the relationship with Saudi Arabia. That the war against Yemen that's involving thousands of civilian deaths. The killing of Jamal Khashoggi was obviously hugely controversial, and so he has to balance that, but the party he represents and leads and that constituency with Saudi Arabia, which is obviously a really important partner, not just in terms of oil and energy, but also regional strategic partner, also in the fight against terrorism. And so it's a difficult balance to be struck for Biden.
And Mariana, that clip that we played at the top of Congressman Ro Khanna, he was saying there that one of the things that America could do to try and correct the balance here is we could stop giving Saudi Arabia weapons. I was sitting there thinking, not sure you give them. I mean, the sale of military equipment to Saudi Arabia is such a huge revenue source for the United States. That's why Trump became their big mate. That's not really something they're going to turn away from, is it?
I don't think they can turn away from it, especially in the context of how little friends they have in the Middle East at the pro. So it's such an important ally in a way that it's a bit like the reason why we keep talking about the US and Biden as opposed to looking at the other side and seeing what they might be interested in is because we sort of assume that weapons are the main thing. And I don't have a counterfactual here, but I'm concerned that we don't even have a conversation about whether there's something else that they might be interested in, or whether there's somewhere else they can look for weapons. I mean, I was looking into how, as of July this year, going back to the oil, as of July this year, they signed an agreement with Russia's Litasco, the trading arm of the Russia oil company. And now about 86% of Saudi imports are of Russian origin when it comes to fuel oil. It sort of shows the connection and how close Saudi Arabia is getting to Russia, and also with other partners. I mean, Beijing has comprehensive strategic partnerships not only with Saudi Arabia, also with the UAE, Egypt, Algeria, and Iran. So they're sort of like playing this game where they have other players within the region that they can go to. And to go back to the question, let's just say that the US seems to have less and less options, and with like this rhetoric of we will have consequences doesn't really bring anyone else to their side, I would say.
Yes, and does the Biden administration really want to strengthen ties between Saudi Arabia, Russia, and China? Interesting. Mariana, I'm coming to you next after this.
Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is unwavering support in challenging times. It's the expertise to try to minimize risk while maximizing opportunities. Can do is being right here for you through every eventuality. Can do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk, and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
So, Mariana, what do you think this week should be remembered for?
Malaysia faces stormy politics and skies this monsoon season.
We suspect that the reason why they want to have the election at this time is because they think the opposition is weak, disorganized, and not registered. So they hope to win. If they wait longer, their possibility of winning would be much less.
Former Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad speaking to the press on Wednesday. Mariana, what was he talking about?
Earlier this week, current Prime Minister Ismail Sabri Yaakob called for snap elections, which are most likely to be held early in November to avoid the upcoming monsoon season, and also because the vote must be held within 60 days of the parliament dissolution. The current king, Sultan Abdullah Ahmad Shah, has consented to the parliament dissolution, and this call comes 9 months before the current term expires.
Why the rush?
So the majority party in the ruling coalition, UMNO, is looking to strengthen their solo position in light of the coalition's internal fighting, but also the opposition being in disarray. However, it is actually not in people's interest, as the former prime minister was saying in the audio, and he's referring to how the UMNO is looking to solidify their position at a very crucial timing. As former Prime Minister Najib Razak, who was in power from 2009 to 2018, has begun serving his 12-year sentence after losing a final appeal in the corruption case that saw his party being ousted from power.
Yeah, I mean, in the clip there, Mohammed was saying that one of the first objectives of the UMNO would be to free Razak from prison. Is it really that necessary for them to do that in such a rush as well? I mean, they're likely to win an election even in 9 months, aren't they? Or at least get a coalition again. Why can't they do it in 9 months' time?
I think it in part it was a reaction to Razak losing the appeal. But also it's important to remember that the party's president, Ahmad Hamidi, is himself currently facing an investigation for 47 charges of grafting. So it's also about derailing the ongoing investigation as soon as possible. And the victory could help the party obtain a royal pardon.
Okay, can we just 101 on grafting, Julia? Because, I hear grafting and I think of Northerners discussing their approach to work. So tell me what it means in this context of political corruption.
Grafting is a kind of political corruption that involves the usurping of state assets. And this all goes back to this 1MDB scandal, which I have to say is just a legendary example of corruption in public office. It was basically this Malaysian state fund which was set up in 2009 when Razak came to power. And he was the chairman. And the US Justice Department believes that more than $4.5 billion was stolen from that fund. And and huge sums were siphoned from it, from these state funds, and siphoned into bank accounts in Switzerland, in Singapore, in the US, and into the personal bank account of Prime Minister Najib Razak, some $731 million. And, there's some really insane transactions were unearthed from the investigation. The Guardian reported that the fund bankrolled purchases including tens of billions of dollars worth of property in Beverly Hills, an apartment once owned by Jay-Z and Beyonce, a private jet, a $260 million yacht, a Picasso given to Leonardo DiCaprio, and tens of millions of dollars also allegedly went towards funding the film The Wolf of Wall Street. So,
What?
this, yeah, I mean, it's an incredible story. It's been happening.
Well, at
It's
least
been,
that made a profit.
yeah, yeah, it's true. But this all came out in around 2015, and it led to the toppling of Prime Minister Najib, who's now serving his sentence for this, as Mariana points out. And Malaysia's politics hasn't really recovered from the ensuing instability of this and the power vacuum that has come about as this, and just the vast web of people who are tainted by this is pretty broad.
And Sorcha, what are the issues for ordinary Malaysian voters in this election?
I think political stability will be at the forefront of lots of people's minds. Whether voters want to vote for a party that has been mired in political scandal over the last few years is another question. But at the same time, this was a party who have almost continuously in power since Malaysia's independence. So the party is essentially the status quo. So it'd be interesting to see if that is attractive to voters, if they do want to sort of revert back to the status quo permanently.
Yeah, well, who are the other contenders, actually? Because as you say, since the 1950s, they've been in power or coalition apart from 1-2 year spell in 2018.
It may surprise you to know that I am not an expert in Malaysian politics, but my understanding is that the Malaysian federal government is made up of two main coalitions, essentially. And the two main coalitions who are now will be vying to form the government are Barisan Nasional, which is part of the current ruling coalition, which includes UMNO, and the opposition coalition, Pakatan Harapan. Those are essentially the two main choices, and there are a handful of other smaller parties, but one kind of coalition is considered to be sort of the party of the ethnic Malay people there, and then the other party is who has traditionally been in opposition, is sort of represents ethnic Chinese and Indian minorities in the country. So that's kind of how the political situation plays out.
And Mariana, despite the fact that this is their third general election in the last 4 years, it is only, in fact, since independence, the 15th general election that Malaysia has had. So you've got this strange thing of they're making a habit of having these snap elections, but at the same time, they're a relatively young country as an independent country with a democracy, aren't they?
There was also more political instability beyond the changing in leaderships within elections. It almost came as a shock, the May 18 election that the ruling party lost, because it was the first one that they lost. But also, they've had several changes recently with the prime minister resigning, so it didn't even go to elections, in which case the monarchy got to play a really big role in intervening and appointing the prime minister that was in power for 17 months in February 2020 as the opposition coalition fell.
And I mean, having a snap election, you only ever do that as a ruling party if you think you're going to win. But there's a trade-off, isn't there, in terms of what it says about you to the general public, I suppose. There's a risk.
Yeah, so snap elections are usually called by the incumbents, often for opportunistic reasons, either because they feel like they are advantageous at the polling or because they have a strong economic position. There was this study of Theresa May's 2017 snap election, and actually they found that overall voters became more trusting of the government if they were summoned to the polls earlier. This was because they saw the snap election it showed that the politicians in question were willing to face the public and therefore were less likely to have something to hide. So while snap elections are this sort of like opportunistic way of having strategic gains over your opponents, it can also alleviate political discontent if the voters are given the chance to voice.
Yeah, but I mean, that's a good example, isn't it, Julia? It might have made voters who were going to vote Conservative anyway feel more confident that the Conservative Party had a mission. But Theresa May lost a whole load of seats in that election.
Right. I mean, I actually couldn't possibly give any sort of prediction of how this vote is going to go, and whether the calling a snap election now is going to benefit the ruling party. But I do want to point out that there is this really fascinating sort of personal drama at the heart of this, because Najib Razak, who is the prime minister behind the 1MDB graft, which led to his downfall. He was the protege of Mahathir Mohamad, who is this sort of elder statesman and former prime minister, who is trying to keep him out of office. And I think he's like 96.
Who, by the way, is apparently going to restand for his seat.
At the age of 96. I mean,
old.
It's just extraordinary. And his new protege, Anwar Ibrahim, when Mahathir Mohamad won the elections in 2018, it was this incredible story because of his relationship with Najib Razak. And he partly won because he promised that he would hand over power after a couple of years to his younger protege, Anwar Ibrahim. They've now fallen out, and Anwar Ibrahim is now the opposition leader. He split from Mahathir Mohamad. Mohamad has now formed his own Malay party, and a bunch of other smaller parties have now emerged as a result. And so, this is a really, really complicated story to follow. But I think the fact that we've seen a lot of sort of personal relationships burning as a result of this, I think, this is the legacy of 1MDB. I mean, Malaysian politics has not been able to get onto steady footing after this scandal.
Okay. Sorcha, you're up next after this. Okay, Sorcha, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is it time to bring on the burp tax?
A lot of farmers that are contacting me are feeling pretty upset would be a mild understatement. It's kind of feeling very ropeable. The message I'm getting from farmers is we must oppose this.
Andrew Hoggard, National President for New Zealand Federated Farmers, speaking to Sky News Australia on Wednesday. Sorcha, what's he so upset about?
So New Zealand's government is planning to tax the greenhouse gases that farm animals make from burping and peeing. This was confirmed at a press conference by New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern on Tuesday. And she said that the government is going to push ahead with the proposal to essentially make farmers pay for their livestock's emissions in a bid to combat climate change.
And this was something that had been proposed in a government paper earlier this year, right? But it sort of hadn't been noticed by people. And suddenly you've got the Prime Minister saying, yeah, we're going to do this. We're going to tax burps.
Yes, and actually it's got kind of a history that goes slightly further back than that as well. It was first proposed by another Labour government in New Zealand in 2003. And at the time it was totally ridiculed and eventually dropped. And, it's basically facing quite a lot of ridicule now because it does sound slightly ridiculous. But there is actually a very serious kind of underpinning to the reasons behind why this tax is being introduced.
Which is basically about reaching carbon net zero, right? So in New Zealand, their emissions are to a large extent from farm animals. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So about half of its total greenhouse emissions come from farms and agriculture. And that's essentially because farming is so vital to New Zealand's economy. And actually, the number of cattle and sheep and cows in the country far outnumber the country's population. There's only 5 million people in New Zealand, but there's 10 million beef and dairy cattle and 26 million sheep. So it kind of gives you a small taster of the scale of the problem.
Okay, and so just briefly, how will this farm levy actually work?
So the proposal is essentially that the money collected from the farm levy which farmers are set to pay from 2025, would be put back into the industry to fund new technology research into ways that we can cut the methane emissions from cows and cattle. And it would also enable farmers to recover the cost lost through this tax by charging more for their climate-friendly products, be that, beef or milk, etc.
You do wonder, Mariana, don't you, like actually what that means? Technology that reduces the methane output from cows. I can't imagine what that would be because you can't really stop a cow burping and farting, whatever you do. So it sounds suspiciously to me like a plan for offsetting.
I mean, yes, it makes me, in a way, feeling a little bit skeptical because it sort of means that the emissions will remain the same. So the impact on climate change will remain the same from these cows, despite the taxes, until it just sort of places the responsibility on the governments to, first of all, manage these funds. And governments have poor track records and low public trust in terms of dealing with climate change as it is. But also it's just like this never-ending circle of like profit as well. And to the point you were making, Ollie, about whether there's something that can be done. There was this university study that showed that seaweed as a dietary supplement can cut methane emissions by more than 80%. And I think last year, the grocery chain Morrison's was trialing using this. So this feels like a more interesting approach to me because you're sort of targeting the problem at the root.
Is harvesting seaweed green in the first place? I don't know. I'm not saying it isn't. Just sounds like you'd have to do it on an industrial scale, wouldn't you, if you're going to feed it to the world's cows?
I don't know how much they need, but also like it also goes to the point on like the illusions of like green capitalism in terms of the planet cannot afford to sustain an affluent lifestyle that involves meat-heavy diets for all of the 8 billion inhabitants.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, isn't it, Julia? The real way to reduce methane and burps is to not eat so much meat. And actually, it strikes me that the farmer that we heard from there knows that perfectly well. And that's why they're angry, isn't it? Because really, this is through the back door saying we need to cut down on our biggest industry because we've got a problem with the environment.
Yeah, I mean, you can imagine the unease for New Zealand farmers, and don't forget that meat exports make up such an important part of New Zealand's economy. I mean, any sort of big grocery shop in the UK, you're likely to find some frozen New Zealand leg of lamb in the stores. And
made myself some kofta only yesterday, Julia.
Lovely.
Doing my bit for Jacinta.
Yeah, the seaweed idea is interesting. I was quite tickled to know that there is a New Zealand company called Fonterra that has developed a product called Cowbucha, which said it could reduce the bad bugs in cows' stomachs that generate the methane. So I don't know if that might be a slightly better alternative. But I think it's interesting because obviously, we are becoming a society that is more preoccupied with climate change and sustainable living. And of course, the meat industry is a very easy target for that. And if you are Jacinda Ardern and you're looking at, trying to see where the winds will blow, and you have an economy that's very reliant on meat production, perhaps this tax is a way of trying to encourage some diversification in your economy.
Can't believe you just said where the winds will blow with a straight face in this context.
Oh God, it's my COVID brain. I'm so slow on the uptake with that kind of thing. But anyways, bear with me, Ollie. But this is the first kind of sort of meat burp tax that we're seeing in the world, and I was looking to see if there had been anything similar that had been introduced elsewhere in the world, some other means of sort of taxing or trying to get farmers to deal with their emissions. And I didn't find anything, but there was an interesting research paper coming from Oxford University published this summer, which actually argued for a meat tax that considered how an environmental tax on meat might be able to work, and the funds of which could go towards helping low income families, because of course if we hike the price of meat and trying to encourage populations to choose more vegetables and to choose more climate friendly options, you're going to end up penalizing poor families who are going to end up paying more for their food. And so it's a difficult political problem.
But I guess not penalizing the farmers, which this is at risk of doing, isn't it? So that's the other thing. The farmers are going to have to pay for their cows are going to burp and fart, and that's their business model. Whereas at least if you're just putting the price up, rich people will still buy the meat and the farmers will still make money.
I don't know if that's true, because you have to look at the maths of scale, and if there is less demand for meat, if there's less demand for your product, that is going to cause some problems for these farmers.
I mean, Sorcha, you've chosen this as your story of the week. What do you think the implications are for us? Do you think we're going to see a burp tax rolled out worldwide?
It's difficult to say country to country, because obviously New Zealand it's quite unique in the position that it's in, where so much of its methane and greenhouse gas emissions come from cattle. But actually, at the same time, worldwide, this is a huge issue that needs to be tackled, especially methane, which has kind of been ignored. Not ignored, but it's not really got the same sort of level of kind of focus as reducing carbon emissions. But actually, we really do need to reduce our methane emissions. And I think it's right to be skeptical over how effective this tax could actually be. But I do think it's going in the right direction, in that we do need to develop new technologies that limit methane emissions from livestock. And I think, what has to happen is that we need to come up with realistic solutions, because realistically, New Zealand is not going to shut down its farming industry or its agricultural industry, because it relies on it so entirely. What it needs is technology, which could be funded by this tax, which allows that industry to continue while cutting methane emissions. And also in terms of sort of saying, well, the obvious solution is that everyone needs to become vegan or not eat meat. In lots of low-income countries, that is just not feasible now, and probably never will be feasible. Lots of the main source of nutrition for people in low-income countries is meat and dairy products and animal products. So we need to find a way of basically keeping those products in the economy, in the system, so people can have access to them, but still kind of mitigating this huge climate change issue that comes along with it.
Well, as we consider how to reduce our methane emissions, I will offer our thanks to Sorcha, Mariana, and Julia. You can write your own joke there. You can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released by searching for The Week Unwrapped. Wherever you get your podcasts, just tap follow. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.